In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt left behind the largest private fortune the United States had ever produced. A fortune that, measured against the size of the American economy at the time, would be worth north of $185 billion today. 96 years later, 120 of his descendants gathered in a single room, and not one of them was a millionaire. The usual telling of that story treats it as a tragedy of bad choices: spendthrift heirs, marble palaces, titled sons-in-law who drained the family coffers into crumbling English estates. All of that happened. None of it is the real explanation. The real explanation is worse and more interesting than a morality tale about greedy grandchildren. The Vanderbilt fortune was not destroyed by poor decisions. It was built on a foundation that guaranteed its own destruction, and the only surprising thing is that it took 3 generations rather than 1. This is the case for inevitability, laid out the way a structural engineer would explain why a bridge was going to fail long before it ever did, not because of any single beam, but because of how the whole thing was designed from the start.
A fortune built by one irreplaceable man cannot be inherited, only spent. Start with the plainest structural problem, the one that gets mentioned constantly in the popular telling and then somehow never followed to its logical end. Cornelius Vanderbilt did not build a company, he built a personality that happened to control a company. The distinction matters enormously, and it is the single biggest reason his fortune could not survive him intact. Every dollar Vanderbilt made came from his own judgment, applied over and over in real time to situations nobody could have scripted in advance. He decided which route to enter and which rival to underprice into surrender. He decided when to buy the Harlem line and when to refuse a connecting railroad access to his bridge until it capitulated. He decided alone, in his own head, without a board meeting, without a strategy memo, without anyone he needed to convince. That is not a business in the modern sense of the word. It is closer to a long, uninterrupted improvisation by a single gifted performer, one that happened to throw off more cash than any other performance in American history.
You cannot inherit an improvisation. You can only inherit the props left over once the performer stops. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited railroads, real estate, and cash. He did not and could not inherit his father's decades of accumulated judgment about which rival to crush and which deal to walk away from, because that judgment did not exist anywhere except inside one 70-year-old man's head, sharpened over 60 years of ferries, steamships, and freight wars. The single most dangerous myth about the Vanderbilt collapse is that William Henry, and later his own children, simply failed to learn what Cornelius knew. They could not have learned it. It was not a body of knowledge that could be taught. It was a set of reflexes built by decades of getting cheated, cheating back, and surviving. And reflexes like that do not transfer through a will. This is why the empire's fate was sealed the moment its founder decided, correctly, that concentrating the fortune in a single heir was the only way to preserve it, and then died anyway. Concentration protects capital. It does nothing to manufacture the judgment required to keep growing it. William Henry proved, for 9 remarkable years, that a capable heir could still add to the pile even without his father's specific genius. That was luck, not structure, and luck is not a plan.
The one rule that worked was never written down as a system. Cornelius Vanderbilt's deathbed instruction was simple: keep the fortune together. It was the single wisest thing he ever said about money, and it reveals, in the same breath, the exact reason his family could not follow it. An instruction is not an institution. A rule spoken once by one man on his way out the door has no mechanism to enforce itself once he is gone. Compare it to what other dynasties of the same era eventually built, and the gap becomes obvious. The Rockefeller fortune, assembled at roughly the same time and on a similar scale, survived for generations past John D. Rockefeller's death for one structural reason above all others. It was placed inside trusts, foundations, and a family office explicitly designed to outlive any single heir's judgment, good or bad. The whole point of a well-built trust is that it does not care whether the current generation is wise or foolish. It enforces the founder's intent mechanically, the way a thermostat enforces a temperature regardless of who is in the room. Cornelius Vanderbilt built no such mechanism.
He built a wish expressed as a dying man's request to a son he trusted, and trust in a person is not the same thing as trust in a structure. The moment William Henry chose to honor the spirit of fairness toward his own children rather than the letter of his father's instruction, there was nothing in the machinery of the estate to stop him, because there was no machinery. There was only a memory of what the old man had wanted, and memories fade exactly as fast as the generation that holds them. This is the deeper reason the family's collapse looks, in hindsight, less like a series of unforced errors and more like the predictable output of an unforced design. A fortune preserved only by one generation's personal loyalty to a dead man's wishes is a fortune with an expiration date built in at the moment of its creation. It was never a question of whether that date would arrive. It was only a question of how many years the loyalty would hold before ordinary human instincts, fairness, love, the desire to be a kind father rather than a ruthless one, reasserted themselves. William Henry lasted one generation. Given what the fortune was actually built on, one generation of restraint from a naturally decent man who could not bring himself to treat his children the way his own father had treated his siblings, was already more than the structure deserved. Fairness is fatal to a fortune, and the Vanderbilts were, underneath it all, decent people. Here is the part of the story that the usual telling gets almost exactly backward. It frames William Henry's decision to split the $200 million fortune among his children as a mistake, a lapse in judgment, a failure to grasp what his father understood. It was not a failure of understanding. William Henry understood perfectly well what concentrating the fortune would do for its long-term survival. He simply could not bring himself to do to his own children what his father had done to his. Designate one favored heir and leave the rest with a fraction of a fraction, litigating their disinheritance in open court for the rest of their lives, the way two of Cornelius's daughters and his disinherited son had been forced to do. This is the trap that a specific kind of fortune sets for a specific kind of person. And it was never a trap the Vanderbilts had any real chance of avoiding, because it grows directly out of the same family's basic decency. A colder, harder man, more like Cornelius himself, might have picked a single heir and lived with the guilt, or simply not felt any. William Henry was, by every account, exactly the kind of person the Commodore had spent decades mocking as too soft for business. A man capable of ordinary paternal love, unwilling to rank his children against one another the way his father had ranked him against his own siblings. That softness is precisely why he doubled the fortune rather than merely holding it. A harder, more suspicious man might have spent his energy on succession politics rather than the actual business. And that same softness is precisely why he split the fortune the moment he had the chance, undoing in one decision what 2 generations of ruthlessness had built. Put it more sharply, the trait that let William Henry run the empire well was incompatible with the trait that would have let him pass it on intact. A man capable of treating all his children equally is, almost by definition, a man who will divide a fortune equally. And a fortune divided among many hands is, as a matter of arithmetic rather than character, a fortune already most of the way to zero. The family was not undone by a villain. It was undone by an entirely ordinary, sympathetic impulse toward fairness, arriving at exactly the moment in the fortune's life cycle when fairness was the most destructive thing anyone in the family could possibly have done. The Gilded Age gave the fortune nowhere else to go. Every heir needs somewhere to point their energy and their money once it arrives, and the culture the Vanderbilt grandchildren were born into offered exactly one legitimate outlet for a fortune of that size: visible, competitive consumption. This was not a personal failing unique to the Vanderbilts. It was the entire social operating system of the American elite in the final decades of the 19th century, and the Vanderbilts, having only just bought their way into that elite over the sneering objections of the older Astor money, had more reason than almost anyone else in the country to play the game as hard as it could be played. Consider what productive alternatives even existed for a Vanderbilt grandchild in the 1880s. Running the railroad required the specific individual genius that, as already established, could not be transmitted. Starting a new venture required an appetite for risk and confrontation that a childhood of unimaginable inherited comfort tends to extinguish rather than cultivate. You do not develop Cornelius Vanderbilt's willingness to run rivals into bankruptcy by growing up in a house with dozens of servants who exist to ensure you never confront hardship of any kind. Philanthropy on the modern, professionalized model that later families like the Rockefellers would use to convert wealth into permanent institutions barely existed yet as a template. Andrew Carnegie would not publish his Gospel of Wealth, making the case for such giving as the moral duty of the rich, until 1889, by which point the Vanderbilt grandchildren had already spent a decade building marble chateaus.
The single most prestigious, socially rewarded use of a great fortune available to a young Vanderbilt in 1880 was to spend it visibly, on houses, on parties, on marriages into aristocratic families that possessed titles but not cash. That was not a failure to find a better path. For the era they were born into, it very nearly was the only path anyone around them recognized as a path at all. This is why the row of mansions on Fifth Avenue and the summer cottages in Newport look, in hindsight, less like a series of individual bad decisions and more like a foregone conclusion. Put the largest fortune in the country into the hands of a generation raised inside the single most competitively conspicuous culture of consumption the country had yet produced. Give them no template for institutionalized giving, no functioning trust structure to restrain them, and no viable path to add to the fortune themselves, and the outcome is not a mystery. It is close to a mathematical certainty. The building of the Breakers and Marble House was not a betrayal of the family's inheritance. It was the single most predictable thing that inheritance, delivered into that particular culture at that particular moment, could possibly have produced.
No institution existed to convert cash into something that could not be spent. Compare the Vanderbilts to the branch of the Singer sewing machine fortune that survived, the Clark family, and the difference is not talent or virtue or even luck. It is architecture. The Clarks converted portions of the same 19th century industrial windfall into a museum and a hall of fame, institutions built with endowments specifically structured to fund themselves indefinitely, immune to any single heir's spending habits, because the money was locked into a self-sustaining structure before any heir had the chance to touch it directly. The Rockefellers did something similar at a larger scale, with foundations and trusts that took a meaningful share of the fortune permanently off the table, protected from any individual descendant's judgment, however foolish that judgment might one day prove to be. The Vanderbilts built nothing equivalent, not because they lacked the resources. They had far more capital available for such a structure than either the Clarks or, in the earliest years, the Rockefellers, but because nobody in the family, not the Commodore and not William Henry, ever treated permanent institutional structure as the goal.
Cornelius's entire model of preservation was personal. Pick the right man, hand him everything, trust him to do the same for the next generation. It is a model that depends every single time on every single generation picking correctly and choosing loyalty over fairness. A trust does not need every generation to get it right. It only needs to be built once, correctly, by people who understand that their own descendants cannot be relied upon to behave better than any other large group of comfortable, unaccountable young people with access to unlimited money. The Vanderbilts never built that machine. They built palaces instead. And palaces, as history keeps proving, are not machines.
They're the opposite of a machine. They consume without producing, and a family that spends a century building bigger and bigger things that only consume, while never building the one structure that only produces and preserves, is a family that has already decided, whether it realizes it or not, how its story is going to end.
The math of division was working against them from the very first split. Set aside culture and character entirely for a moment and look only at the arithmetic, because the arithmetic alone was enough to guarantee the outcome, given enough time. Cornelius Vanderbilt concentrated 95% of a $100 million fortune in a single heir. William Henry doubled that fortune and then divided it among several children. Each of those children, in turn, divided their share among children of their own, and so on, with every generation adding more heirs to draw from the same shrinking pool, while nobody was adding meaningfully to the pool itself. This is not a story about greed accelerating with each generation. It does not need to be. Simple division does the entire job on its own, with no help required from anyone's personal failings. Take any fortune, however vast, and subject it to repeated division across an expanding number of heirs while the underlying capital produces no further growth, and the amount available to any single descendant shrinks geometrically, not slowly, but on a curve that gets steeper with every passing generation. Add to that the fact that the assets themselves, the mansions above all, were not merely inert stores of value sitting quietly while this division occurred. They were active liabilities, consuming staff wages, coal, taxes, and upkeep every single year, whether or not anyone was living in them, converting a fortune that was already shrinking through division into a fortune that was simultaneously bleeding through maintenance. A fortune under those two pressures at once, division from below and consumption from above, does not require any dramatic villainy to reach zero. It only requires time. And the family had, from the Commodore's death in 1877 to that millionaireless reunion in 1973, nearly a century of it.
The one instruction that might have saved it was also the one thing the culture punished. There is a final, sharper way to see the inevitability here, and it is worth stating plainly, because it is the least comfortable part of the whole story. The only strategy that had ever actually worked, concentrating the fortune ruthlessly in a single capable heir while leaving the rest of the family with comparatively little, was also the strategy the family's own social world would have punished as monstrous had anyone in the third generation actually attempted it again. Cornelius could do it in 1877 because he was a feared, friendless old man who had spent his entire life being called ruthless and had stopped caring. By the time his great-grandchildren were coming of age in the 1880s and 1890s, the family had spent enormous effort and money buying its way into the very society that prized exactly the opposite values: generosity, gracious hosting, a wide and lavish circle of family and friends, the appearance of easy, unstinting abundance. A Vanderbilt in 1890 who tried to disinherit most of his own children in favor of one, the way the Commodore had, would not have been quietly admired for his discipline. He would have been the subject of the same kind of scandalized newspaper coverage that had already dragged the family through court once over the Commodore's own will. In other words, the family had, by its own choices in the prior generation, spent its way into a social position that made the one strategy capable of saving the fortune socially unacceptable to use again. That is not bad luck. That is a closed loop. A family whose successful climb into high society in one generation manufactured in the very same act the social pressure that would help dissolve its fortune in the next. The Astors, the family the Vanderbilts had spent a fortune buying their way past, dissolved in almost the identical span of years, for almost identical reasons. Two families chasing the same social prize ended up trapped by the same mechanism, because it was never really a personal trap, it was a structural one, built into what it meant to be old money rich in that particular American moment.
What destined failure actually looks like. None of this required a single villain, a single act of stupidity, or even a single stroke of bad luck. It required, instead, exactly what actually happened: a fortune built on the irreplaceable judgment of one man, preserved for one generation by a personal instruction rather than a legal structure, inherited by a decent man whose very decency guaranteed he would divide rather than concentrate it, released into a culture that offered no respectable outlet for a great fortune except visible consumption, converted disproportionately into assets that produced nothing and cost everything, divided again and again across a widening circle of heirs while no institution was ever built to hold any part of it out of reach, and trapped by the family's own successful climb into society inside the very rules that would keep the one working strategy from ever being tried again. Take away any single piece of that chain and the story might have played out differently. Slower, perhaps, or with a smaller room in 1973 rather than an empty one. But take the whole chain together, exactly as it existed, and the collapse was not a possibility among several. It was closer to the only possible outcome, arriving on the fortune's own schedule rather than on the schedule of any one person's foolishness. Cornelius Vanderbilt built the largest private fortune his country had ever produced using a genius that could not be inherited, protected it with an instruction that could not be enforced, and then died and left it in a world that offered his descendants no template for doing anything with unearned billions except spending them beautifully, one mansion at a time, until there was nothing left to spend. The tragedy of the Vanderbilts was never that they failed to see this coming. It is that there was, given everything the fortune was built on and everything the era demanded of them, almost nothing they could have done to stop it, short of becoming a different family entirely, in a different country, at a different moment in its history. The empire was not lost. It was, from the day the Commodore closed his eyes in 1877, already spending down a clock nobody in the family had the tools to stop.